Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another week of AdvoChats. Today's topic is urban housing, and we will start in a few minutes. We're still waiting for our guest to arrive. Let me...
Ashanthi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you. Hi, Iromi. Good evening to you. So before we proceed, I'll try to remind the audience that you can send in your comments and to the chat box below. A bit of time at the end of the session. Now for our session on urban housing, we have President of Johnson Securities PLC, and Iromi Perera, Director of it's really good to have both of you here today. Both of you have done a lot of work in this particular area. You've spoken extensively on this topic. And so, public housing, right? Sri Lanka has had a long history of government housing, right? You've had the million housing program in the 1980s, the 1.5 million housing program in the 90s, the urban regeneration program, and all of these, right, have had mixed results. What would you say is the core policy issue that surrounds urban housing and that Sri Lanka has faced in the last few decades? I'm going to actually start posing this question to Iromi, and then Nayana, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter. Iromi?
Sure. Thanks for having us today. So I guess to get down to your question, you're right. We have done a lot of public housing projects over the years, and they have really been mixed. And what I think we need to look at the components that drove each of these different projects and see what worked and didn't work is if you take a look at the Million Housing Program, in a lot of ways, it was a very, very successful project for a lot of different reasons. And I think two of the main reasons are, one, that it was hugely participatory when it comes to the community. It was very much community driven. They were involved in from the project design to the actual designing of their homes, the networks, the establishment of the community development councils, for example, gave a lot of decision making and autonomy to the community members who were able to advocate for even access to the grid, accessing home loans and things like that. So there was a real sense of ownership that the community had during the Million Housing Program, and it's something that they still talk about even today. The second thing that really worked for the Million Housing Program was tenure security. Everyone who got a house under the Million Housing Program got an official housing document. Some of it were outright title deeds. Some of it came under the NHDA, but there was tenure security, which really goes a long way for communities because it is an asset then. It is an asset that belongs to you. It is an asset that is recognized. And then you feel safe in investing in your homes, which is what people do over time. They incrementally build their homes. They develop their homes. For a lot of low-income communities, their housing journey happens over generations. It doesn't happen in the way that it does for, say, middle class or upper middle class, which is where, you build your final product, you get your furniture, all of that happens in, 1 or 2 years or 3 years. For, the working class poor, this housing journey is sometimes generations long. So that's why things like, the fact that you have a say in your house, design and location and everything, plus tenure security goes a long way. And then you come to what is happening right now, which is then the most current project, the Urban Regeneration Project, which has unfortunately sort of gone against all these good principles that the state and various local agencies built in the 70s and in the 80s. And they're building high rises for people where people don't have a say in anything, including design, location, whether they even want to move. And there is no tenure security. These flats are not given to people for free. People have to pay 1 to 1.5 million rupees over 20 to 30 years. and they don't get compensation for their old home, which they have put all their savings and investment into over time. Plus, it is a very different built environment. Moving from a floor level or ground level house to an apartment complex is a huge shift. And those things, it is a mindset change, it is a lifestyle change. The whole form and the function is very different. And people are not consulted in these new kinds of housing. And for me, that's where I feel like that housing, when it comes to public housing, we've sort of gone backwards.
My apologies, I muted the mic. I agree with you there, Iromi. Nayana, your thoughts on that particular issue? Has the urban regeneration program forgotten all the lessons that they've learned, all the experiences that housing in Sri Lanka
sorry, little patchy. Sorry to cut you. Hello?
Yeah, is it better now? We can hear you, Nayana.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with Iromi because the Million Houses program was actually a path-breaking program worldwide. Actually, that started a global movement of kind of ground-up housing development with very light intervention, social mobilization, and we were the pioneer in the world actually at that stage. And a lot of the folks who worked on that went on to work for lots of international agencies, kind of spreading this work globally. And it's somewhat unfortunate that we actually have regressed and we're starting to do things maybe a little too aggressively, which is problematic. But I think part of the problem is, the rush to get results, right? The earlier approach was a little bit more incremental, much more ground up, much more involving the communities, which allowed for kind of an evolution. Whereas here you're kind of doing shock treatment. You're kind of putting people into completely different environments, which they are really not used to, and that creates lots of shocks. But to me, actually, the thing to note here is a lot of times the justification for it is that we really just don't like the way it looks. We just have this thing of, oh, it's not nice, so it must be in some really beautiful, elegant thing, which really is not true. In the end, I think housing is about lived experience, and we really need to think about what is the lived experience. But if it's okay, Ashanthi, I just want to take a step back and maybe ask, in a way, we need to ponder the question, should the government really be in housing in a big way? And where in the market should they be in housing, right? And it's unfortunate when you see this in many cities where, the first knee-jerk reaction is, okay, we've got a housing problem, let's bulldoze, low-income communities and put them in high-rises. It seems like the policy prescription that everybody seems to love and never really seems to quite work. But in Sri Lanka, one of the things my pet peeve over the last time, there's a lot of debate, lot of argument, lot of advocacy around the low-income communities, lots of mistakes being made as well. But there is like no debate about kind of the middle. And if you look at what's been happening over the last decade or two, Colombo's been really emptying out of middle class, and it's a city of the rich and a city of the poor. And the middle is out. And I think that's a huge policy gap that I think Sri Lanka really needs to take head on and deal with, right? And I think it'd be great if that kind of policy dialogue actually starts. And in this space, there's also this even bigger question of, okay, this group of people maybe has more means and so on, but should the government be in there at all, or what really the government should be doing? So that's another kind of area of debate. And you've seen over the past few years, different kind of things tried. You do see the government trying to build middle income housing, My personal view is middle-income housing, given the right incentives, given the right structure of a program, can be completely done through the private sector. But it just needs to be set up right. And the incentives need to be set up right. The programs need to be set up right. And you really don't need to pump much treasury money into this at all. But there needs to be a really sharp policy focus on it. And I think that is completely missing.
Iromi, do you agree with Nayana there? Can the private sector take on middle-income housing? Would they be better at it than the government?
I mean, honestly, at this point, anyone would be better at housing than the government. So your bar is very low there. But yes, I agree with Nayana. There is a huge gap when it comes to middle-income housing. And at the same time, when we talk about housing, also, I think what's interesting is that in Sri Lanka, we talk about housing mainly in terms of ownership, right, Nayana? Like we've had this conversation before where we don't talk at all about the rental market at all.
Yeah.
And it is in many of the other cities that we work in, it is almost unheard of that everything is geared towards home ownership and towards renting, and that is almost seen as something that is undesirable. But actually what is happening is that it's happening in the suburbs, it's happening in the peripheries where things are different now, aspirations are different. Actually, maybe there is a generation of people who don't want to be homeowners and people who also can't afford to be homeowners. But that doesn't mean that they have to, kind of get stuck in this space of, not very nice housing or having to commute from very far, live very far, commute very far. So that is also another gap in the middle-income housing that I see, which is that of rental housing. Because ownership also means you're going to stay there for the rest of your life, right? Whereas things are different in the way that we change jobs and we don't go into a job for the rest of our life. I think the same has to apply to housing also. So in that sense, I think there is space for the private sector as well. But here...
Do you mute your mic, please? I think there's a bit of feedback. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Iromi, I'm sorry to cut you off. Could you hear?
Yeah, no, I was wrapping up anyway. Basically to say that, yes, I think there is place for the private sector here because what we've seen over the last few years is that the government can't be the sole sort of player in the housing game. And, it is arbitrary, the way that they set the policies, the way that you have to deal with the state. And at least in the low-income housing sector, the whole task has been given over to, in terms of the urban development authority that is not mandated to actually be a landlord. And that role is actually more, it's actually supposed to be played by, for example, the National Housing Development Authority, who has the authority to do so. So even when we talk of the state, we also have to talk about who should be working on housing. We have an issue here where you have multiple agencies who are doing the same kinds of work, and there is no sort of cohesion around the kind of work that they do. And in order for everyone to have access to things, but also have a say in things, we do need both the private sector and the government in this, in this housing sector, whereas largely now we see the private sector being quite absent. And obviously, I think Nayana can speak better in terms of that experience, I think.
Could I chime in there, Ashanthi? Just to mirror what Iromi is saying, really, I think it's interesting in Sri Lanka. You're absolutely right. The rental housing market is kind of like somehow you're like a lesser person if you rent versus you own. That's a little strange and something we really kind of need to get past. But if you look at what happens because of it, because home ownership rates in Sri Lanka are actually quite high compared to the world. And then you would ask, then what's the problem? The problem is people own, but they live in really, really suboptimal places or suboptimal conditions, right? So if you look at, and that's really clear, again, I say this over and over again every time I go to one of these little forums, but the pattern of development that you see in Colombo is just getting further and further and further away from the core. But people still have to converge on this core in Sri Lanka. And that is evident by kind of, the millions of trips that you have coming, crossing Colombo every day. So you have people living further and further and further away in different qualities of housing and not being so quality conscious of your housing and sacrificing huge swathes of your life because of this choice of, I want to do this. And very rarely do people think about what does this really mean, right? Because as I said before, in a way, housing is about your lived experience, right? And if you spend huge chunks of your life going up and down in a vehicle, you really do need to think about, okay, now we think a lot more seriously about how much does this cost in terms of fuel and stuff. Now people are really starting to worry about it and to try to carpool and this sort of thing. But you also need to look at what's the social cost. What's the social cost of children spending, huge chunks of their lives sitting, in cars, really just exhausted by the time they get home. The kind of social interaction they get is very, very different. So I think the thing is, this has not really been studied in detail. And that's part of the problem. The policy focus has at one level been, okay, how do you, maybe misfocus, okay, how do you deal with the poor communities? Then there's some emphasis on, okay, how do you enable high-end luxury developments and such in the name of something really nice and shiny, and nobody really looks at the middle. And I think Sri Lanka's domestic problem is primarily the middle, because whatever other house, so the other thing that happens is in the cities wherever there is reasonable quality housing, the poor get displaced. So people who could otherwise move into these kind of middle income settlements get pushed out. So you have a systematic pricing out, and this middle is, to me, the biggest policy challenge. And related to that is this whole argument of connectivity, but we'll get into that somewhere later, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. So you mentioned connectivity, right? And you've long since been a vocal proponent of transit-oriented development. How important is connectivity when we think about livability, right? Because Colombo is a multi-ethnic, multi-demographic city, right? And when we think about livability, how important is connectivity? Could Nayana maybe respond to that question, and then I'll.
I think connectivity is fundamental, right? It's fundamental. You can't see, the thing is this: you can't talk about housing without also talking about connectivity to where people need to be. A lot of the reason low-income communities, even in appalling conditions, sometimes stay in the cities because they can get to their jobs really easy, right? But the same is true for the middle, but somehow they get pushed further and further away. And I think connectivity is fundamental. And the question really is, how quickly can you get people back and forth? It's really not a question of what's the distance from point A to point B in kilometers. It's a question of what's the distance from point A to point B in time it takes to get there, and maybe cost it takes to do that commute, which then transcends into the rest of your life. So I think it's fundamental. And the fact that we, over the last easily 3-4 decades, have just always prioritized roads over any kind of mass transit it's a sad indictment, actually, because again, 40-50 years ago, we were one of the leading transit driven cities in the world, actually, certainly in Asia. And we've dismantled it all, and we've all gone full car, and we've just really neglected our public transport over and over and over and over again. And that's fundamentally flawed, and that doesn't allow us to get the kind of density that you need to make, housing developments for the middle and the upper income groups more viable, and it just creates so many distortions. So I think it's absolutely fundamental. And I think we're barking up the wrong tree with cars versus mass transit. You really need a fundamental mindset shift, a policy shift towards, look, let's do mass transit. And once you do mass transit, there's all these distortions we have in policy also disappear, like our parking policy. You don't need that much parking. We have lots of empty parking garages in the city. You really don't need it, and you don't have to look only at ourselves. You look around the world and you see as cities evolve, people start to repurpose these parking garages because if you've got mass transit, people really don't use cars. And in Sri Lanka, cars are very, very expensive. So,
yeah, I'd like to apologize. I had some technical issues on this end, but yes, could Nayana, could you please continue with what you were saying?
Can you tell me where I got cut off, actually?
I think you were talking about parking, last I heard.
Yeah, okay. So let me try to rewind this kind of discussion on transit a little bit. I think once you make this shift to mass transit, you fundamentally change the way you need to build. Because right now we build our cities around cars. So you have huge roads and tons of parking. In our parking regulations, for example, in housing, it's like for every apartment unit you build, you need one slot of parking, which is a bit ludicrous, actually, because if you look at cities that have kind of progressed very heavily into mass transit, many of them, you end up having to repurpose all these massive empty parking garages, and you really don't need it. So, and the thing people don't really think about is when you have really bad regulations that are very, very land intensive or space intensive, then you get much less efficiency in your build, and then you put stuff beyond affordability of people as well. So it's all kind of linked, and maybe that is part of the problem we have, that we look at housing policy in Sri Lanka in isolation and separate from transit policy, and we look at transit and transportation policy without really looking at how housing will work, or any kind of urban development will work for that matter. That's why you have these huge linear developments, and every time you build a new road, it's all great for the first maybe 2 years, and after that you'll have shops along every single foot of it, and it's all jam-packed again. And then people think the problem is parking, and then you try to allocate more space for parking, and it makes the development unfortunate. So you just get into this vicious kind of downward spiral, and it's hard to do, but you really just need to take a step back and say, you know what, let's reset the way you're thinking about this. You have to put this kind of lived experience first. You have to put travel time first. You have to look at efficiencies of mass movements of people properly, and position housing so that it just plugs into an overall system without looking at these things in isolation. It needs to be looked at integrated. And I think our agencies are also quite isolated, and they really don't work together enough, and that's part of the problem, actually.
Iromi, do you agree with Nayana on that point?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also when we talk about integrated transport, we also have to think about things like, stations and routes and things like that. I remember, I think Nayana, you and I spoke about this many years ago when they were coming up with the map for the mass transit. And one of my first observations of the different routes that they had mapped out was that somebody who doesn't take the bus has obviously come up with this, because it was so disconnected from the various bus routes that if you wanted to, and you have to think about people taking multiple types of public transport. If you have a metro system, you have a bus system, you have to assume that people may take both to get from, end to end. But unfortunately, in the same way that we have people building high-rise apartments who have never lived in a high-rise, you also have people who are planning transport and transport routes who have never taken public transport in their life, so they don't know what the experience is like, but also they don't think about what that whole experience would be like. So your metro and your bus, there has to be some alignment where you're not kind of having to take a three-wheel from the metro station to the next point you have to take your bus. So you really have to think holistically. And again, things like street lighting, where are people going to, where are the busy spots? Again, all of this, you have to have the various agencies working together. Otherwise, there's no point in, one agency working separately. And that's exactly what's wrong with the master plans. They're all coming up with various ideas, but there's no coherence between these various plans.
Can I chime in on that? Yeah. So I agree, Iromi, that the bus and the metro need to kind of dovetail. But I don't necessarily agree that you should say look at the existing bus network and plan a metro line according to where the buses go now, because the buses actually can be easily rerouted, right? And you're absolutely right. When you look at transit systems and housing, you're really looking at end to end, right? Point to point. How does somebody get from point to point? And it oftentimes involves more than one mode. So your bus systems need to feed into kind of the heavy systems, which are most likely rail based. So again, it's this integrated look that's required, rather than bus people fighting train people, which is kind of unfortunately what happens in our country. You want the bus people and the train people to work together and say, "Hi guys, let's make this work properly as one integrated system." And those folks need to talk to the housing people and say, "Look, shall we build housing where this kind of feeds in?" And maybe office and other kind of development needs to say, "Oh, let's just build on the other side of that," so the whole system works, right? So integration is kind of the key. So if we don't develop this policy culture of saying, look, let's look at interdisciplinary, intersectoral collaboration and find cohesive solutions, we're going to spin our wheels.
Right. Now, stepping away from connectivity and transit-oriented development, can we maybe look into some of the other features of livability, right? What needs to be taken into account when proceeding with a housing plan or housing project? What factors of livability need to be considered? Yeah, good. Iromi?
Sorry, what factors of feasibility is? I couldn't hear you clearly.
Livability. My apologies. What aspects of livability need to be taken into consideration?
Maybe Romy, you can take that first out.
Sure. Again, when we talk about housing, and when we talk to policymakers about housing, everyone's really only talking about that house, the structure. So if you take, for example, the government housing projects, they're talking about the flat. And when we talk about middle-income housing, we are talking about that house or that flat. But a house or any, it's more than that. When we talk about livability, it's about what happens also around all of that. For example, things like public space. Where do people congregate? Where do people, and again, when we talk about in our work, when we talk about the low-income housing, when we talk about space, there are really only two things that policymakers talk about. One is shops, the other one is car parks, and if at all, the third one are things like children's playground. But nobody talks about what everyone else does with that space. For example, where do women go to, just hang out, just chill? It's almost like leisure is a luxury that can't be afforded to people. For example, you assume that they're going to live inside their flat the entire time. Whereas if you take any of the luxury development complexes, what do they talk about? They talk about more amenities that are built into the complex, things like parks, pools, recreation places. There are so many different things that when they talk about livability, there are all these other things, that they talk about, which we don't talk about when it comes to public housing. Again, it's this idea that, free time, leisure, just the ability to hang out and chill, do some gardening, all of those things are not luxuries or privileges that can be afforded to the middle class or low income community. So in that sense, when we talk about livability, we have to think about all the different people who are going to live in that space, and at the same time grow old in those spaces. These people are not going to be young forever. And Sri Lanka has, we know very much about the aging population. And then you look at buildings that are actually not built with, thinking of universal accessibility. They're not thinking of older people. They're not thinking of persons with disabilities. So it's all, so there are so many things that they don't think about when it comes to livability. And at the same time, we are not thinking for the future, for example, for the fact that, cities are getting hotter. So are we then building housing? Are we building apartment complexes, keeping heat in mind? And, there are loads of studies and, things that are being done around the world looking at the impact of heat and climate change on buildings. But we don't see these factors being considered in, the whole livability conversation. People do say our houses are getting hotter, our fans are on all the time, but we don't really talk about why this is. So for me, in that sense, livability, you have to kind of talk about all these things. Where do people spend their free time? Where, just thinking about all the things that are pitched to the high-end housing market. How do you, kind of integrate that kind of thinking into the middle income and the low income housing as well, while also keeping these buildings future-proof, particularly with heating and, making buildings more energy sustainable.
Can I chime in? Yeah, so I agree. Generally, you have to look at, again, back to this concept of what's your lived experience in it, and you don't spend all your time in your house, right? So what is the rest of the city doing for you? Which is why every time we open some new park or something, people just gush in there because we have such a shortage of these kinds of spaces. So every time we open one, it's like fantastic. People love it. But the interesting, to me, one of the most interesting things is this emerging socio-economic segregation that we are seeing in our cities, right? If you look at our communities, say a generation ago, which is much more rural based, communities were much more integrated, right? So yes, you had rich folks and upper crust folks and whatever, and then you had the whole swathe of people just kind of live in one integrated community. We have now evolved to where we say, if I'm rich, I don't like to look at the poor. I don't even want to see them. So you engineer view sheds so you don't see the poor. And the same way, like the poor feel very, very threatened, and you have this kind of separation. And again, the middle just go off and live in the suburbs. And even there in those suburban communities, you're all about walling in your compound and creating your fortress. It's not about opening it out into a community. So it's a fundamental shift that we are going through. And we are seeing a level of socioeconomic segregation, which I think in the medium term is extremely unhealthy. Our sense of community that we have in any of these environments is really quite weak, particularly in our suburban environments, because, people are just walled in. You don't really have these communities. So, Iromi is absolutely right. So when we do large scale developments for kind of upper middle income and the higher end developments, a lot of emphasis is like, how do you create a sense of community here? How do you create an environment where people can come outside of their concrete box, if you will, and interact and create social bonds and so on? But that really does need to happen at a social level, and you need to have a mixing of different people. It's fundamentally important for our society, right? So the statistics are a melting pot, but we really don't live in integrated pockets. We live in segregated pockets, and that's not healthy for us as a society. And that needs to change from a policy perspective, right? So you, again, with zoning, the types of housing, the types of land you release for what type of housing, you need to mix it. You have to mix it.
If I can also just add to that, completely, this segregation that particularly that we're seeing in Colombo is really, really quite appalling. And yes, it has to be a policy intervention in that sense, but in that sense, the government, we also have to, I think it's an ideological issue also. We have demonized poverty for so long. Then if you even look at a lot of the, what is being said about low-income communities in Colombo, if you look at any of the government literature, they they have painted communities in a particular way that makes them feel very dangerous. And that is also when the middle class and the upper middle class make that shift, saying we don't want to live with low-income communities. Why? Because they're thieves, they're drug addicts, they're drug dens. Never mind the fact that half the middle class and upper middle class are taking drugs and, you know, stealing from the country anyway. So you have this kind of moral issue that then demonizes the poor, and also then justifies the government in relocating them to, you know, where you can't see them. You know, where we used to have, you know, really nice colorful vattas before, they're now, you know, out of sight, out of mind, that kind of attitude. So in that sense, we also have to kind of question these kinds of narratives also around development, around poverty, around the kind of people who live in Colombo, and look at people beyond the fact that, I know people say this a lot, that, you know, the working class poor are the backbone of Colombo. The city won't run without them. But at the same time, there's no one kind of talking about it beyond their utility value, right? The fact that they have lived there for generations and so on and so forth. So in that sense, we also have to kind of learn to, I think, push back against these kinds of dominant narratives. And even when we talk about the government wanting a slum-free Colombo, why don't we talk about a poverty-free Colombo as opposed to a slum-free Colombo? So I think there is then a responsibility even on us as citizens, as people of Colombo, of people who use these cities, to really question, question it. Otherwise, we also then accept this segregation, unquestioningly, and that is hugely problematic.
Nayana, do you have anything to add to that? Or has Iromi covered that point? Because that was actually a very interesting point you raised there, Iromi.
You're very quiet, Ashanthi. It'd be good if you could speak up.
Yes, I'm sorry. Nayana, do you have anything to add to that? To what Iromi just said? That the government always...
No, I think that, I think we're perfectly aligned on that. Actually, you have to look at these, the problem again is it's just with us not looking at these holistically, right? And the social segregation is quite striking in Colombo, actually. For example, if you in some countries you'd have, say if you want to mix a housing block. Now the US has programs like this where if a developer wants to build a certain amount of housing, if they start selling X number of units below a certain price point accessible to much lower income levels, they get tax credits so they can build higher density, or they get certain easements. So you almost put commercial incentives to integrate better, and that gives people a way towards social mobility, right? Because one of the problems now is we are very address conscious, no? Like I like to live. I live in Colombo 7, or I live somewhere here. There's prestige associated with location. I mean that is true in many parts of the world, but in our case it's a little bit kind of extreme, because on the other end, if I say I live in XXX, you are like, okay, you're this. And anytime a child fills out their address and they puts I'm from whatever public housing building, you're automatically immediately stigmatized. So you start from a footing of I carry a label on my head saying I have a certain socioeconomic strata, please treat me accordingly. So you need to shed that baggage. And again, it's a question of how do you structure cities to do this? And a big part of it is, again, not how government builds housing, but how government builds policy around housing, right? So if for example, we are actually very, very serious about bringing much more affordable housing into the city, say bringing people from the burbs in, then you need to be able to allow development to happen at that price point and still be commercially viable, right? Right now, developing at the middle point is basically not viable because we have para tariffs which are ridiculous. By the time you get a steel bar from the port to your site, it's like double or more the price. You have protectionism on tiles, on this and that, the other. So your cost structures are really quite bad. So people just don't bother. And then your land price integration must happen, then it can very easily release some of the state land, and there's hundreds of acres of this, to say, look, certain amounts must be developed at this price point, period. That's what it is. And then everybody will adapt around it. It will just happen. And particularly if you give certain relaxations or certain incentives for people to do that, the private sector will certainly do it. It's right. Just right now, it's not commercially viable. For example, if you take the land price off, or bring it really, really down on state land, then you could do it. When you get state land at 20 million bucks a perch, the only thing you can build is super high-end housing because it's dead on arrival otherwise, right? So there was this interesting experiment that we did actually a few years ago. Judy and NHTA did this accelerated program for middle-income housing where we actually gave away land at cost to the government and said you must build housing. 80% of the housing units you build must be below 5 million bucks, or sold at 5 million bucks. 20% you can do whatever you want. And some of those projects I recently visited, turned out really quite phenomenally. So if you get the incentives right and the government really wants to do it, they can do it. But it's not a quick fix. It takes time. It can't be heavy-handed, and you've got to let the market kind of work. Because if you build housing saying, look, this is what in government we think needs to be done, and it's a one-size-fits-all, it really doesn't work, because then people need some sense of identity. Markets have competition, so people just incrementally improve products. So there's this kind of evolution that happens that doesn't happen in kind of mass public housing. So change in approach really it needs to happen, and it can be done, but it takes time. You can't. Cities don't evolve overnight. You have to have like a policy perspective that transcends an electoral cycle. And you need to be able to stick through something, maybe through 2-3 election cycles. And that's one of the reasons we don't do mass transit, because any rail project is going to take 5 or 6 years. So by the time somebody gets it, somebody else is going to cut the ribbon. So road, 6 months, 8 months, you do it and you're done. You cut the ribbon and you get the votes the next round. So that needs to fundamentally change. Yes.
Right. So we looked at a couple of the issues surrounding housing and housing policy. Can we maybe look at solutions to this issue, right? Could maybe Iromi and then Nayana maybe give your take on possible solutions to overcoming all of these issues that you just mentioned? Yeah.
One is obviously just to pick up from Nayana's last point, which is that we have to kind of get over this quick fix approach to urban development. None of this can happen in 5 years. Actually, if you were to do it properly, whether it's housing or mass transit, just consultations and public feedback alone will take a couple of years. And never mind the actual construction period. So if you want to do something that will last, that people will want to use, that people will want to live, you actually have to be committed to the long game in that sense. Nothing is really a quick fix. So, in that sense, like you're looking at a complete sort of a culture change in politics in that sense. But in terms of what can we do, I think when it comes to things like housing, particularly low-income housing, middle-income housing, let me just start with low-income housing. My point always is don't break what's not, don't try to fix or don't try to take away what's not broken. And Colombo in that sense is an unusual city when you look at South Asia, which is that we don't have sprawling slums, and state support and people's own investments over time has hugely contributed to this fact. We don't have significant or like masses of migrants coming into the city and making settlements larger and larger within a short amount of time, which you see in India, you see in Bangladesh, for example. You don't see that in Colombo. And that is because the housing journey here is very different. It's incremental, it's very different. And if you even look at the statistics, even 10 years ago, 90% of Colombo's low-income settlements, their housing fell into the category of permanently upgraded, which is amazing. You know, those are the kind of statistics that other cities aspire to have. And yet what we are doing is we are kind of breaking that and then giving them a whole different kind of a built environment. So in that sense, my suggestion here would be look at where the need is. And I'm not saying that there are people who are in low-income communities who do need better housing. I admit that. And then look at how do you give them better housing. Look at in situ upgrades. And these are some of the things that worked quite well in the 80s during the Million Housing Program, which is that you didn't take people and move them far away. You looked at what their needs were within that settlement. And if that was possible, you did in situ upgrades. If that's not possible and you have to move them, you have to look at it in a more holistic way. Maybe you give part of the land up to a private developer. You use some of that investment to build housing, you know, maybe low-rise housing and not high-rise, because high-rises for low-income communities, it's a completely broken model. So maybe consider things like low-rise housing instead of high-rise, in situ development. Another way to, you know, really fix the housing issue is also to fix the transport issue. If people can get to the suburbs easier in a more affordable way, they actually wouldn't mind moving out of the core if they don't, you know, the center of the city, if they don't need to be there. Why people don't want to move from the cities? Because it really just comes down to a huge amount to the commute. They don't want to be traveling in a bus or a train for 2-3 hours a day to come to Colombo. But if your commute is shorter, people wouldn't mind actually moving out and commuting every day. So for me, those are some of the ways in which you can fix this situation. But at the heart of it really is really down to what do we really need all of this? Do we, you know, in that sense, we need to have more information. There has to be more, you know, transparent data about the market. And so that, you know, even the private sector can then make those decisions, can make that kind of strategic plans about where the need is without constantly going into the higher end, because that's the only thing that's viable. And really looking at where the need is. And if you don't need to basically fix something, just leave it, you know, it will correct itself on its own.
Nayana, we have a few minutes left. Would you like to?
Yeah, so it's kind of weird to say this, but I think the first thing you need to do to fix housing is to focus on public transport. Because without that, you can't unlock the land markets in a realistic way. So everything kind of falters. So we have to pivot and have a very, very sharp policy focus on public transport and investment in mass transit. I think that's like number one, right? Number two is I think we really need to look at strategically how does the government release its land banks associated with those upgraded transport networks, right? Sri Lanka Railways and SLTB are two of the largest landowners in Sri Lanka, actually, the city in the urban areas, right? If you really strategically release those with the right incentives, targeted for housing at the right price points, then you really start to unlock this. But to make that happen, so one is transport, second is land release in a rational way with the right incentives, with the right structure, and the third is look at costs to develop housing and how do you fix that, because there's two levels of problems. One is just para tariffs and import controls and protectionism that needs to just really be broken down so that the costs, there can be massive cost savings there. And the other thing is, look at policies that are driving cost structures to unsustainable levels and really progressing that. And parking policy is my pet peeve on this, because every time we look at it, and I have teams looking at projects all the time, we always come back to how do you deal with the parking? As soon as you start dealing with the parking, you just can't make it work. So so there's a couple of things, but it starts with transport, and then finally I would say people need to talk to each other, different agencies, different disciplines, and try to work together, not in silos.
Okay, that is all the time we have for today's AdvoChat session. Iromi, Nayana, thank you so much. It's been a very informative discussion, and we hope to have you back on board sometime soon. I'm afraid we don't have time for questions from the audience, but we will be back next week with another session of AdvoChats. In the meantime, please follow our social media pages, AdvoChats Institute, AdvoChats Plus, and AdvoChats Perera. We'll see you next week. Good night and goodbye.